Good afternoon. Welcome to this exciting panel discussion we're going to have today about a new report that CNAS just released, Over the Brink, with the lead author, Andrew Metrick. It was also written by Phil Shears and a little bit by me, but not really. I'm Dr. Stacie Pettyjohn. I lead the defense program here at CNAS, and we're really excited to have this conversation today. We have with us, we're very lucky to have Dr. Justin Anderson, who is a senior policy fellow at the National Defense University Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction, and an expert on nuclear deterrence, nuclear weapons, and arms control. And we're here to really try to begin to unpack some of the implications of China's nuclear buildup, which is something that has received a lot of attention in the press, but I think is an issue that we're just beginning to scratch the surface and to explore. And we've been fortunate to have a series of projects that is looking at this issue that has been funded by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. So we're very grateful for their support and them allowing us to explore this very fascinating and oftentimes very unsettling issue. I guess I will say up front, we are going to talk about this particular report and discuss issues about potential nuclear use. This is all hypothetical, and it hopefully will never come to pass. This is why we're here to talk about it, so that we can hopefully deter it. So with that, I'm going to dive into asking Andrew and Justin questions. I will take questions from the audience, both the one here in person and the virtual one. If you're online and you have a question, please identify yourself. You can do so in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, or you can tweet at us with the hashtag CNAS 2024. I will try to intersperse them as we go along from the virtual audience, and then leave a good bit of time near the end to engage more fully with both the in-person and folks that are watching online. So without further ado, let's talk about China's nuclear weapons. This is a topic that, 5-10 years ago, didn't really think much about at all, but we've seen China undergoing this massive military modernization with a lot of focus on conventional forces. You hear a lot about the Navy and the fact that it surpassed the size of the US Navy, and they're having this big buildup. But then there's also been in the news some different stories about the silos that were discovered in Western China, where they're building new ICBM fields, as well as some more exotic weapons like the fractional orbital bombardment system, potentially with a hypersonic glider on the front end, that have been reported in the news. But I think we want to step back and try to understand what's going on, because China hasn't actually said a lot officially about their nuclear modernization, unlike their conventional one. So since there are so many different pieces of it, let's try to pull this apart. Justin, what do you see as the most important elements of China's nuclear modernization? Do you think it's the number of warheads, which have gotten a lot of attention in the DoD reports, the new delivery systems? What sort of strikes you as being really significant?
Well, Stacie, thank you for the question. Thanks to Stacie and Andrew and the whole team here for the opportunity to be part of this panel today. And let me do two things up front. One is to encourage everyone to read the report. I think there's a lot of merit in the report's approach and the things that it says, both findings and recommendations. And also to give the requisite upfront caveat: views I express today are my own, not those of National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So it's a good question, Stacie. I mean, I am tempted to say it's all the above. It's all concerning. But let me go a little deeper and say, while the overall number of warheads is very concerning and something that you have to track quite closely, I think from my own perspective and the work that I do, it's important to also focus on the diversity of delivery systems. So there's lots of reasons why overall volume of arsenal is something that does need to be focused on, but and a concern I also have is to look at, this is now an arsenal that has both what we often label as strategic systems, so there's the long-range systems, You think of a strategic triad, ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Also now, China's Air Force, again, has a nuclear role with some of its bombers. But at the same time, you also have systems that are dual-capable theater range systems. And I think it's important, this is an important thing the report calls out and was an important part of your tabletop exercises. These systems are different. Their role is quite uncertain. Very little is said about them by the Chinese. And these are the types of systems that are probably going to be most relevant in an operational sense. They're all important, but in an operational sense, these are the systems that I think would be quite concerning within something like a regional conflict.
That I think I agree with you. Andrew, what's your view? Do you agree with Justin? And what do you think the implications are for U.S. efforts to deter Chinese conventional aggression, especially through a strategy of denial, which I know you have many thoughts on, that the nuclear buildup has an impact on that?
So I think that I agree with Justin, and it's very good to point out the differences in the capabilities of the systems that the Chinese are developing. I think one of the other things I want to highlight around that systems development piece that I think is most concerning from a U.S. perspective is the diversity of strategic launch systems that are being developed. So Dr. Vipin Narang, in his earlier work before he joined the administration, has this concept of different nuclear postures that enable different concepts for how you do nuclear operations. And one of the things that if you were interested in sort of a more limited approach that historically the Chinese have espoused in terms of the way that their writings have talked about nuclear arms, you would end up with a nuclear posture that looked like what they had 10 to 15 years ago. The systems that they're developing today, silo-based, things that have a degree of promptness, more advanced SSBNs, all of those systems, you can use that with a doctrine like the Chinese have traditionally espoused. However, it enables a whole different set of nuclear warfighting approaches that appear not to be in line with some of the no first use stuff that they've come out and talked about. So I think that, to put a little bit more of a fine point on Justin, some of the stuff that you were talking about, I think that's really the concern, is the uncertainty surrounding not just the bean counting of the systems, but the breadth of operational concepts, and not necessarily operational concepts from an operational level of war perspective, but operational concepts from a strategic nuclear warfighting perspective that they enable. But to dive back to sort of that sort of operational piece of it, I think the uncertainty around their theater systems, the one that everyone sort of talks about is hot swap DF-26. There's very little, I think there's like one line in the China Military Power Report that DoD publishes each year that sort of talks about this. So again, there's tremendous uncertainty surrounding it. But when you're confronted with that uncertainty, one of the things that you can go do is you can start looking at Chinese writings about conventional warfighting. And you see things in there that if you hold them up to the light and pass through that, you can see at a sort of theorist level, you could see why some of these theater range weapons would be very appealing and fit neatly within a conventional theory of warfighting that really stresses long-range strike, that stresses systems destruction warfare, and the removal of key nodes off the battlefield. And in that context, theater nuclear arms appear to be, I'm using a lot of kind of weaselly words because we're out in the future, appear to be highly efficacious and potentially advantageous when viewed through that lens.
Yeah, it is really unsettling, and there is a lot of uncertainty. And you mentioned China's declaratory policy, and I think we have to bring that up and talk about it because what states say does matter. And there is a big difference between China's stated policy and the nuclear posture that they are developing right now, which is raising all of the questions that we have. So, Justin, you have engaged with various Chinese officials and interlocutors, academics who study these issues and work on them. Do you have sort of your own theory to explain this divergence between their posture and their declaratory policy? And also, what have you heard from them in terms of how they account for the various buildups that are underway right now?
Sure. It's a very good question, Stacie. Obviously, I have to be careful in protecting some of the discussions of, in forums like Track 1.5s. And also, we're very fortunate that recently we were able to re-engage with China's National Defense University, so an NDU to NDU dialogue. And I think that kind of mill-to-mill engagement is important. But let me speak a little bit more broadly to the range of engagements and say a couple things I would observe. One is that I think in the Chinese system, it takes a while for changes in policy and doctrine and strategy to appear, if they're going to appear at all, in public-facing documents. And I think part of what is going on is that China is building a lot because it can. And is perhaps itself still working out some of the full implications of what it means to have the capabilities now available to it. And I think there's probably a process of working through exactly what that is going to mean for its strategy and doctrine into the future. At the same time, the Chinese interlocutors wouldn't themselves say this directly, but I also feel that it's no surprise that China and with its present leadership and Xi and just the perspective that he seems to have on what does it mean to be a major power, that there has been a conclusion that a major power nuclear force, kind of like what the Russians and the Americans have, is something that he's decided to move forward with. So in terms of how this fits into a broader approach to nationalism and competition, I don't think there's any sort of surprises there. I think the one other thing that I would say is that it does seem to me, and I'm speaking broadly across a number of different engagements, not just myself, but other scholars have had with Chinese interlocutors, that there was, not even that long ago, a general denial that a buildup was going on. I don't think we'll ever get something like a confirmation, but there seems to be less certainty or vociferousness in denying that a buildup is going on now. So that doesn't necessarily mean you'll get a lot of detail, but I think it does mean that they are moving to a different place in terms of their level of comfort in talking about nuclear things that is worth noting, and I think will become more important into the future.
And I want to follow up sort of on some of the NFU pieces that you sort of teased out there, because I think it's really important when you talked about the nationalism piece of this and sort of China's belief that to be a great power, it must possess certain of these capabilities, because that's something, to be a bit of a history nerd for a second, that you've seen before inside Chinese strategic culture. And in the late 60s and 70s, they're developing an SSBN. And lots of Western analysts would look at that and say, in the middle of this period of great turmoil within China, why are you developing an SSBN? Because there's some degree of national prestige associated with that. And there is a line of Western strategic analysts, which I might consider myself one of, who looks at the Chinese development of aircraft carriers and goes, why? And looks at that critically and says, if you believe things about a future missile-dominated combat regime, you might think that aircraft carriers don't represent the best, bang for your buck in that. But there are these prestige capabilities that are viewed as some part of the barrier to entry to being a great power. And so if you view some of this through that lens, there is an element of making sense. And I go back to too often in this business, we look at things through the lens of there is a rational choice, and that rational choice exists in sort of a perfect world. But in this, you can really see how those rational choices are bounded and informed by a broad set of different features. And I think the nationalism point that you point out is really important to think about. That said, it does open up this huge degree of uncertainty about the final destination. Once you build all this stuff, you do in fact need a doctrine that explains why it exists and what it does.
Well, and regardless about what you say publicly about it and how you intend to use it, when you have it, you can change your mind in real time. And so if you are a good realist and a good sort of prudent defense planner, you worry about the capabilities, the capabilities first. So I think it is interesting, and you certainly are seeing there's at least an element of emulation in trying to reach that status of a great power. But there are important differences in terms of the capabilities that China has than what the United States has, where they have strategic or theater systems or non-strategic systems that the U.S. doesn't. And some of that's a legacy, right? This is where we get into problems with the vocabulary and just how we think about deterrence, because in the Cold War we said strategic and non-strategic, and that really meant could it fly across the world. But for China, who is also trying to deter India and North Korea and Russia, systems that we would consider theater range non-strategic have strategic effects for them. And I think there are a lot of differences between the Cold War and the situation that the United States faces today, where it's looking at two nuclear great power peers. And this is one of the things that we really hit on in this report, and that was a focus of it. So I wanted to turn to you first, Andrew, and then I'll bring you in, Justin. And what do you think are some of the lessons that American policymakers and strategists have taken from the Cold War, and that might not be true as they think about nuclear deterrence and escalation management in the context of a conflict with China today?
So I think that at a fundamental level, like, we need to be reminded that, you know, deterrence is fundamentally a game of risks and costs against a backdrop of uncertainty, and you are trying to convince your adversary that the move that they're going to make is not actually going to pay off in the ways that they believe that it will. So like that, and it's fundamentally a human endeavor. You know, the capabilities are important, and we can often, you know, have very great discussions about the bean counting and system performance features. But ultimately, it is a game between people and the beliefs that they have at any certain time. And if you go back to any of the Cold War interactions between the U.S. and the USSR, those key facts sort of shine through time and time again. But I think that we can forget some things about the role that geography plays in determining, especially for the theater capabilities, the escalation pathways and nature of those escalatory dynamics play. So the one that we highlight in the report is the nature of fighting in an archipelagic theater. The most obvious one of those is that whilst, you know, any sort of nuclear detonation would be a monumental event, there appears to be a fundamental difference between detonating nuclear weapons over water than over land. There are different effects. There is a different potential for collateral damage. And if you believe that escalatory pressures are a result not just of the things that you mean to destroy, but the things that you destroy that you prefer potentially not to, especially in terms of civilian populations, you can start thinking about how very carefully targeted nuclear weapons have very limited amount of that effects and very specific tailored military effects. And that is really enabled by a more maritime theater, a theater where there might even be things that are on land, but they're distant from almost everything else, and they're military specific. So that, you know, that's sort of the difference with the theater, and I think it's very difficult to talk about nuclear weapons today without talking about the precision revolution that occurred over the past 30 years. And while I have tremendous respect for the people who sort of developed that way of thinking, one of the problems with it is that when you go back and read the foundational documents around the RMA MTR period, it was really focused on conventional warfighting, and it stopped at the nuclear edge. And you could also make the same argument about a lot of folks on the nuclear side, as it stopped at that. And so that interface between the conventional and the nuclear, I think, is the place that where, especially when we think about the Indo-Pacific into the future and the U.S.-China relationship in specifics, there's a lot of new ground that needs to be plowed in that space.
So Justin, do you think we're overblowing the differences? You know, there is some truth to the idea deterrence is deterrence, or do you think there are important distinctions between the situation today and the Cold War?
Well, let me first observe that as I was reading the report last night, I was struck by when think back to the sort of Cold War lessons learned, it seemed that one of the biggest lessons many people learned was, gosh, I'm glad we never went to nuclear war and I never want to think about this again. And I mention that because I think there are important, useful lessons to take from the Cold War era, but we should be very clear on the distinctions. And Andrew, I think, has made a couple important distinctions in that the nuclear dynamics of the Central European plane between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, are different than the nuclear dynamics you might have within a contemporary Indo-Pacific scenario. It doesn't mean it's not important to understand both. I think my larger concern, and one of the reasons I'm very happy to read this report, and there is some other, it's a small but I very much hope growing field of inquiry and literature, is to begin to actually unpack nuclear escalation dynamics in a contemporary sense. I hope taking some good lessons learned from the past, but also identifying where things are different today. And that's important because I think, unfortunately, too often nuclear escalation is sort of treated like this black box, that we can't understand it because, fortunately, we don't have case studies, but nevertheless, you can't study it, you can't understand it, let's just try to avoid it. And I think the problem there is that unfortunately, I think, sometimes leads to poor analysis and ends up taking all nuclear stuff sort of out of the equation, whether that's analyses or people are trying to do plans or things like that. And that just fundamentally can't fly anymore. I think it's transparently obvious that our adversaries are seeking to exploit concerns we and our allies have about things nuclear to try to gain an advantage, all the way from well before crisis to just trying to set the terms of discussion, debate, operational dynamics, everything. That's a problem. That's a problem for us right now. And if we're not doing detailed study, interesting analysis, doing things like tabletop exercises like this study does, unfortunately, I think we'll continue to fall into this trap of thinking this is just something we can't study, sort of can't handle, and we just kind of wish it would go away. It's not going away, and it's something that we really need to understand better moving forward.
I completely agree. The ostrich strategy is one that would come back to bite us in the end, I think, and this is where war games or tabletop exercises are really useful, since thankfully we don't have real-world instances of nuclear weapons being used, but they allow us to explore these hypothetical futures and to work through some of the trade-offs with different courses of action and to understand what your adversary might be thinking in that situation and why. So I want to, there's at least one or two questions from the virtual audience so far. I would encourage you to keep those going in. I will try to incorporate it soon. Andrew, you sort of gave a good segue by mentioning precision-guided weapons and the relationship between conventional warfighting and nuclear deterrence and escalation risks. And I want to give Andrew credit for coming up with this idea. It came from his brain entirely, what he calls the nuclear crossfade. And I think it's something that's really interesting and at the same time unsettling. And it is basically taking issue with the idea that escalation is a linear ladder. And a lot of us, the con has been critiqued to death. But even recently I heard someone drawing on their Cold War sort of understanding experience, say it's an escalator, right? If you start it, you're not going to be able to get off until the world's ended, and it's not clear that that is entirely true. So, Andrew, can you explain the crossfade concept and what sort of created it and what it means? Yeah,
so I think when you go back and you look at Kahn's work, it's very insightful and it's very helpful. I mean, I was reminded as I was writing the study that Kahn does talk about escalation growing by leaps and bounds. So he definitely acknowledges the nonlinearity of the space. I think the problem oftentimes is less his actual writing and more the mental model that it sort of casts upon one. When you talk about a series of steps, it has an implied series of linearity. And the thing that I probably take the most umbrage from that sort of 44 steps is that, we transition from the conventional phase and then above it are all of these nuclear steps. And thinking about what advanced conventional warfare or to use the other term, a mature precision strike complex actually lets you do from a warfighting perspective. There are options on that conventional ladder that would be higher than nuclear options. The extreme example of which is, some things that have been talked about in international security about using conventional weapons to conduct, counterforce operations. And if you sort of had this you had an incredible conventional capability that could remove the entirety of your adversary's nuclear forces like that. That's a conventional warfighting tool that is clearly more escalatory than, say, a demonstration nuclear strike in the middle of nowhere, whether that be on your own country or on your test site in your own country or over the ocean in some place. So that's an extreme example to make a point. But the crossfade is really that. What we're talking about is that the nuclear and conventional escalation paths aren't contiguous. They don't line up. They're two different processes going on. And the risks and pressures that they create in total will change your behavior or influence your behavior. And there's this odd zone that occurs within conflict. So the war is going on, and it's a high intensity conventional conflict between two nuclear powers. So it's this sort of place we've never been before from a global perspective, where the escalation risks are just deeply, deeply uncertain. And it's that uncertainty in this crossfade zone that I find particularly unnerving. So last year I wrote a report called Rolling the Iron Dice, which was looking at the prospects of conflict protraction in a U.S.-China conflict. And I came to the unsettling conclusion that they're growing for a variety of reasons, also related to this advanced precision warfare concept. And in that case, these nuclear risks sort of loomed as a thing to go look at. And I think, Justin, to your point, is like, this is the place that we should be looking. And it's not just in the places that we're talking about here, nuclear and conventional arms. There's the whole cyber, IO, EW spaces of this. That's yet another domain for us to be talking about creating these escalation risks. And when you go read things like the Science of Military Strategy on the Chinese side, they talk about IO and cyber having strategic deterrent effects greater than nuclear arms. It's in their talking, which is a very different way of thinking about it. So to your earlier point, that is someplace, that is sort of, I think, the direction that we should be marching from a intellectual study perspective, so that we can understand what is going on and we can avoid that, the risks associated with that lack of knowledge.
Justin, I'm curious what your response is to this idea, whether you agree with the idea that there could be conventional attacks that are more escalatory than limited nuclear ones, and relatedly, whether you think China could find warfighting utility in using theater nuclear weapons in a conflict.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting concept, a compelling one. One note perhaps I'd have for the study, which is part of a series of studies, as you noted, Andrew, was to say, I think you can actually expand the concept further. It's just one area in which, and I know you're not saying this, but it's just one area in which there's a nuclear conventional interplay, overlap, complex dynamic that is worth studying further and all of us better understanding. Well, let me give just a pure hypothetical. And I'll even put it in the context of a tabletop exercise. Let's say you're running a tabletop exercise where there are two major powers, and some dispute arises within a region, but it's over a piece of territory that's not the homeland of either major power. This dispute becomes a crisis becomes a conflict. I think both teams would possibly reach a point where they would say, I have the option of imposing costs on the adversary by using conventional long-range strikes that will hit important things on their homeland that will impose costs. But I don't want to do that, because now if I hit the homeland, I cause homeland casualties. I think they're going to be even more in than they are now. But there's this thing I want to do, this regional theater objective, and it's really important. And well, maybe I'll hit that with a nuclear, and then I bet the team would have this interesting internal debate of, is that theater nuclear employment against something that's in the region but not the homeland of my opponent, if I hit that with a nuclear weapon, is that actually less escalatory, sort of less problematic than the use of a conventional long-range strike that will hit their homeland? I think they'll probably have an interesting debate. I won't speculate as to how that debate is resolved, but I just give that as an example that I think is a good one, and I think highlights one of the important points of this nuclear conventional crossfade, which is there is this implicit assumption too many people have made for too long that the use of any nuclear weapon of any type anywhere would automatically push the the escalation button, and Stacie, you mentioned earlier, so the escalator then goes all the way to the top immediately. I think that's just a assumption that I think is flawed, and I think it's worth unpacking, and I think the nuclear conventional crossfade should at least make people ask questions. Actually, to go back to my tabletop exercise scenario, are there certain uses of non-nuclear things that indeed would be considered much more escalatory than something like this particular form of nuclear employment? And I think that's an important question that I wish more analysts would ask.
Yeah, it is hugely important, hugely complicated, and hard to predict. And you imagine, depends on the individual who's making the decisions, their perceptions. You might find a conventional attack on space assets that you think is the first of a larger, more existential threat that's coming to be something that you need to take care of. There are a lot of questions there, and I think there are a lot of assumptions that people make about what is necessarily a hard red line, when in reality those may differ. And in the context of protracted conflict in particular, you've seen where red lines are things that evolve and that can change. We've seen this with Russia and Ukraine, where Ukraine has launched kamikaze drones at Russian nuclear bomber bases, and that didn't elicit some escalatory response, which has been surprising.
If I could quickly do a two-finger, though, Stacie, because I think this actually was missed by a lot of coverage at the time, as well as for the follow-on analysis. Now, a lot of what Vladimir Putin says is not true and spurious, and take all that on board. But after that happened, Putin noted that was one of the reasons for them to suspend participation in New START, making an argument that, well, now something has changed in terms of course, he accused us, the Americans, of giving the Ukrainians the technology, and this hit one of our nuclear-capable bomber bases. Now, again, most of what he says is spurious and not true, but it is an interesting example of this conventional nuclear sort of complex relationship, because, of course, that's not even the United States. This is Ukraine doing something that just happens to affect one of their bomber bases, but then it having, part of a way in which he is trying to justify no longer fully, fully participate in the New START. And I think we're just going to see more examples of this, more examples of where something that is happening in a non-nuclear domain has this impact, whether real, imagined, or spun to be real, on things nuclear that I think a lot of people sort of haven't fully absorbed yet.
Yeah. So when we think about the potential for nuclear use, this obviously gets to the idea of escalation control and intra-conflict deterrence, managing escalation when you're fighting and how you can go about doing that. We think a lot about deterrence, before a crisis actually becomes a conflict, hopefully, and what you need to do to signal your resolve and your capability. And this is one of the areas that in our TTXs that our blue teams struggled with, teams that were playing the United States with their options. So, Andrew, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the U.S.'s options for signaling and ability and willingness to respond to try to prevent China from using a nuclear weapon during a conflict? And what are the limitations of those? Are there other capabilities that might be needed?
So this is one of the things that when you TTX and wargame a lot, you start to come away with some pretty strong beliefs about signaling, mainly because people tend to be very, and you see this when you do case studies of history, people try to be very clever with how they do signaling, and they like to say, well, we've done this thing, and therefore our adversary will know what we mean. And from gaming and historical record, like you kind of got to hit him over the head with it. And I think that from an American perspective, there's a reluctance sometimes to be sort of direct. Because oftentimes it's seen as wielding a cudgel, or we make a moral argument about there's some innate immorality with making threats. So like there's something to unpack there from a political perspective that I am not the right person to do. It's a fascinating question. But from like a signaling perspective, and then there are folks in the room who will probably come up afterwards and tell me how wrong I am, but like, there's probably a need for more visible signaling options from a nuclear perspective in the United States. Silicon Man has a lot of really good operational characteristics. To me, it is not the easiest weapon in the world to signal with. And so in that context, if you're talking about the Indo-Pacific theater, how do you signal with nuclear arms is an uncomfortable question to start to ask, but it's kind of one that needs to start to happen. And I'm of the opinion that you want options that are incredibly visible to your adversary so that they know exactly what you are doing and you kind of want to tell them. So that when they do something that that you do not like in a conflict scenario, when we're talking about intra-war deterrence, which means our risk threshold must be higher because we are already at this state of war, you need to be willing and able to do things with theater, non-strategic nuclear arms to show your adversary that you have skin in the game, to demonstrate credibility, and to attempt to maintain intra-war deterrence. And so what that probably looks like is you're probably having to work with the Air Force and others to think about how you put the right platforms with the right weapons at the right places. And that's a sensitive conversation for a lot of different reasons. But it's something that, we probably need to spend a lot of time thinking about now so that it's a playbook on the shelf. So when we need it, we can take it off and execute it.
What are your thoughts, Justin, on deterring limited nuclear attacks?
Well, that's a big question. Let me take the signaling piece first. And just to add on to what Andrew said, I think that the history of what we know of, and we have some good case studies from the past. It also would be nice if we had more and better evidence, more contemporary, but that's very hard to get. Various forms of national level signals, to include attempts at nuclear signaling, often have not been successful, at least not successful in communicating the signal that was intended. So that's certainly concerning. I think the only thing I would add is that in addition to capabilities and visible capabilities being able to send important signals, and sometimes that is quite important to be able to send a nuclear capable bomber into a region. The more modern variant of sending them forward and you knew the other side would see them is, and I think this is smart, we send them forward and there's public affairs press releases and there are tweets and you see the bomber sometimes accompanied by Allied fighter aircraft. And that sends a really strong and useful signal. But beyond capabilities, I would just also note, of course, the signaling that leaders send, the bully pulpit of the president and the things the president says is important, and also the importance of mechanisms like, for example, the MOLINK, the Moscow-Washington hotline, something we have with the Russians, something that we don't have an exact equivalent of with the Chinese. Doesn't mean we don't have ways of sending them messages, but we don't have the exact same equivalent. So signaling, if you can imagine almost like a matrix of there's a level that's important, then there's the tool that you use or the mechanism, and then there's the actual signal that you send. That's already complex. You can see, or at least in my head, already like a 3x3 matrix, and probably there are more things to put in there. And this is where it starts to get really hard. So nuclear signaling is difficult, and I think in the Indo-Pacific, it merits additional both study and also thinking, do we have the right capabilities, tools, sort of messages ready to go to be able to send deterrence signals given the very different nuclear dynamics of a region, growth of the Chinese arsenal, what North Korea continues to do, that's not even necessarily talking about the South Asia dimension, which is also important. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of complexity there to work through.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. You mentioning Korea gives me a good segue to bring in an audience question here. I'm going to actually turn to the in-person audience in a minute, so if you have questions, get ready. I have more, but I'm going to try to restrain myself and let other people speak. So we have from Patrick that the report, the extended deterrence recommendations are focused on Japan and Australia and thinking about fighting China over a Taiwan scenario. Are there any implications for U.S. South Korean extended deterrence?
I mean, the Korea angle of a potential U.S.-China conflict, I think, has been one of the great. We're talking about sort of unexamined beliefs, and sort of the role of South Korea within that potential space is something that, at least in all the games I participated in, just sort of like put on a shelf, and we're like, yep, the Koreans will just be there, and like that will just be a thing, and like we're focused over here. To Justin's point of it's worth thinking more about, and I think the reasons in the report why it focuses on Japan and Australia is because they are two of the U.S.'s closest allies. Period. Which seem to be the U.S. has a broad alliance structure, but there are people that we are more comfortable talking with than others within the alliance structure, and there's differing degrees of comfort on certain issues, and that was sort of the focus, and so it was a crawl, walk, run approach. So at some point within all of this, have to engage with the South Koreans, have to engage with the Philippines, have to engage with a broader set of U.S. partners in the region. But yes, the implications for the South Koreans are there. They're also kind of just hard for us to know because it is so I don't want to say difficult. It is impossible to unlink it from the ROC DPRK deterrent piece of the puzzle.
You brought it up, Justin, so I'm going to give you a chance to see if you have any thoughts on U.S.-South Korean extended deterrence. But I would just say, I know, like Andrew was saying, we typically decouple China conflicts from what's happening on the peninsula. But I know your colleague Phil Saunders was doing some work and saying that was going to have to change in the future. But I think the pace of North Korea's nuclear expansion and buildup is also potentially influencing those dynamics and what the South Koreans could bring to a conflict with China.
Yeah, I think more broadly, here in Washington, we acknowledge, and it's an important part of a lot of the things we do in the Indo-Pacific, that there's an extended deterrence and allied assurance dimension that's different than it used to be in the past. Now, that's sort of most pressing for our South Korean allies for sort of obvious reasons, given North Korean nuclear developments and overall bellicosity. But it also means, I think, that everyone here is familiar with our current hub and spoke model for alliances within the Indo-Pacific. I think I would just observe that we're working very closely with our South Korean allies on a range of conventional nuclear integration issues, and in fact, just did a tabletop exercise with them, the first of its type. Wouldn't be surprised if more are done in the future. But this is where, in some ways, and I can't think of a better term. This isn't a perfect term. It's a laboratory for having to work through some really challenging issues of conventional forces. What are the role nuclear forces that are playing? How does escalation work? How do you put together a conventional nuclear integrated deterrence posture that is really going to address the alliance needs? Now, that plays out in a certain way on the Korean Peninsula, but there is a lot that will be relevant out of that to other allies as well. And that's born out of just the changing nature of the threat within the region.
Couldn't agree more. You make it sound so serious and sophisticated. It's a laboratory. I would say a sandbox, and make it something much more childish sounding. So, does anyone in the in-person audience have a question? Go over here first. Please introduce yourself and then.
Thank you. Hi, Amy Nelson from Brookings Institution. Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments today. This was really interesting and compelling and thought-provoking, and I look forward to reading the report. So, hearkening on Stacie's question about how are we doing deterrence differently today than we did in the Cold War? Andrew's thoughts or comments that we're in a much more high uncertainty environment, and Justin's eloquent description of the overall complexity of the deterrence tasks at hand make me come back to the idea that we are now trying to do deterrence in an arms control free environment, and this is exacerbating or kind of pushing on all the buttons that you guys mentioned. So if we are now trying to can we effectively do deterrence in an arms control free environment when those two concepts were once upon a time so tightly coupled in the name of strategic stability? Number one. Number two, if we're in a higher uncertainty environment, we're in a higher risk environment, potentially, right? And is US policy currently well suited to this higher risk environment? What should we be doing differently? And three, how complex, uncertain, and different from the Cold War does the threat environment need to be before a window for arms control could open again?
Amy's a former colleague. Amy's a former colleague, so I think that means she gets to ask a complicated three-part question, although I don't know about answering every single part. Let me respond to the arms control piece of it. And then I'll leave the other very challenging parts to Andrew and Stacie. Amy, as you know, and as you and I worked together in the past, a part of my career was in arms control implementation and compliance. So it's kind of hard to see the poor fortune, the current state of nuclear arms control, which is not great. Agreements getting rolled back or suspended or what have you. I think that the uncertainty that could follow when New START expired, suspended right now, of course, or by the Russian side, will sunset in February 2026, which isn't that far away. After that, I don't think actually the Russians themselves have fully thought through the implications of what that could mean over the long term. This move was about Ukraine. As all sort of Russian foreign and security policy is right now. And part of their jettisoning of agreements and general diplomatic bad behavior is all revolving around Ukraine. I think on the balance of the ledger, to have a general agreement, now not full agreement, but a general agreement on deterrence and arms control issues on things nuclear, had a positive overall, positive benefits overall for the Russian Federation. They've broken that now, and they're going to have to live with the consequences. And I think those consequences include, yes, a future where arms control plays no leavening role. I think within how we think about deterrence, how various states, not just the United States, think about what nuclear security looks like, and what that means in terms of the forces they'll develop and deploy and maintain. And I think overall, they've just made an uncertain world more uncertain to include for themselves. And I don't think Vladimir Putin's really thought through the consequences. Some of his colleagues probably have, but are too scared to say anything about it. It doesn't mean that arms control is dead forever. You and I ourselves have worked on things where we point out in the early 80s, people said nuclear arms control is dead for a variety of reasons. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, negotiations had fallen apart. We were just in a poor place. Then a couple aging Soviet leaders pass away. You get Mikhail Gorbachev, and a couple of years later, you have the INF Treaty. So things can change on a dime. And I don't think any of us here can claim that we know exactly what's going to happen into the future. I think I'll just say major powers, now I'm talking about arms control more broadly, not just nuclear arms control, major powers at various points have recognized that arms control negotiations and agreements can be win-win for both sides or all sides involved. And that's something that can bring them to the negotiating table because it can manage risks and costs when it comes to arms competition and other things. that sort of dynamic doesn't go away even as particular arms control agreements go away. So will the U.S. and Russia, or U.S. and China, or some other combination of major powers, be able to have a mutual realization that, again, arms control may be beneficial? I certainly think it could happen again in the future, and that's just based on reading of past history. But we're in a bad place now.
So I think there were sort of three thrusts to your question. So can you achieve effective deterrence in this sort of arms control free world? I think yes, but it's going to cost you more money. Is sort of the straight bottom line, dollars and cents. What can be done differently? I think in the short term, unfortunately, it requires the U.S. to accept additional risks, which sort of compounds itself by creating more uncertainty. But that is sort of the nature of, again, this game about costs and risks between people. I think it's really important to talk about the sort of Andropov to Gorbachev changes, because part of this is you can do all the right things, but if you don't have a willing dance partner on the other side, which you don't necessarily always get to choose, sometimes you just luck into, you might not actually get to what you want from that arms control perspective. But I think that there are, or I hope that there are some low-hanging fruits in the arms control world when we start talking about like confidence building measures, especially if we can use new emerging technologies around AI as fora, or if there are other conventional arms where we can have fora where we can build rapport. It's great to hear that the NDU to NDU talks are continuing, because there is the costs are potentially so high when we're talking about deterrence failures that there is almost a moral obligation to, even when it seems like we are unable to make any progress, we kind of keep having to go back to those salt mines, because it is so, the payoffs are potentially so large. So that's sort of my three-part answer. None of them are good answers. We're not in a good place from an arms control perspective. But I think, as the Chinese build-out continues, you might see they might be more willing to talk about it. But that is going to create this period of time, because they're slow in sort of their own internal processes, of greater tension, uncertainty, and for the U.S. to effectively manage it, we're going to have to accept more risks and probably pay some more money.
And we need two dance partners right now, which is even harder than finding one. But it doesn't mean you don't try and you don't look for the stars to align. I thought I saw in my peripheral vision a question over here. David.
Hi, David Ferenckerg with Northrop Grumman. Thanks, guys, for this. Especially being willing to engage in a conversation about escalation with nuclear weapons. It's just one of those taboos that have been stepped to the side for a long time. And whenever nuclear weapons show up into a game, they get quickly pushed over because it's complicated and messy. And one of the things that I think this is value that you guys have shown in a TTX, focusing on both conventional nuclear, but more really how the nuclear comes in this, is trying to unpack this. I'm getting to the question, logic. We love to put a rational face over escalation in general. Like there's things that people do rationally as they consider when they should escalate or how they should escalate, or what things signal it's time to escalate. And I'm curious what you observed in the TTX. Was there a logic difference between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons? Like was there some compelling rationale or logic that informed the decision about whether this was escalatory or needed to escalate with conventional versus nuclear? Was there behavior on the either side that was viewed as escalatory behavior, and there were differences? The teams had a different view of that. I'm just curious, is there any possibility that there was any tinge of a logic about escalation? Because we have no empirical evidence to really sort of evaluate this.
So I think a lot of the logics behind why teams or how teams thought about escalation were related to their beliefs about the payoffs of that escalation. So there was a perceptive payoff associated with that escalatory approach and so they're basically making that cost judgment. And so versus risk? Yeah. Yes, versus the risk of sort of escalating yet further. And this is a thing that you see across a variety of different games of people making those choices. But like, why this is probably the greatest degree of uncertainty around any TTX design, not to nerd out on TTX design, but the way that people and players, both in TTX and players in a real world situation, view those risks and those payoffs are, we can TTX that to the cows come home, but you're going to have your sample size will be 1, and it's the time you roll into it. And that is very hard for us to understand. And that's one of the reasons why in the report we talk about, gambling for termination, of like, these are all fundamental gambles. And one of the reasons why protraction sort of at least appears to change those payoff curves is like getting out of a conflict appears something that a leader wants to do, but how the process by which that happens is like a giant question mark. And so that lack of a causal framework for achieving termination, in Fred Eichel's book, Every War Must End, it talks about like wars go on past when rational men conclude they must end, roughly paraphrasing him. It's that observation like turned up to 1,000, but how you get to that point, and nuclear arms might be the way to do that.
Was there a difference? Do you see a difference between conventional and nuclear?
I mean, I think there definitely was, and I'll let either of them correct me if I'm wrong, because Justin played it in one of our games too. But Andrew had a logic that was different for the Chinese limited nuclear use. It's not just the gambling for resurrection, which people are more familiar with, your back's against the wall, you don't have any other choice, but more terminating on favorable terms because you're unwilling to pay the long-term costs to actually win conventionally. And there might be pressures domestically, right? You have to remember, I was just talking about Hein Goemans and his book about leaders getting killed, in authoritarian states. It's not just you lose an election, it is sometimes your life or the regime's survival that's at stake. And the logic that Andrew came up with was a bit more of the didn't want to have to fight the whole slog, even if we thought we would win eventually. And some of that would probably be due to domestic pressure. In terms of responding and whether you use conventional or nuclear weapons, I thought, and we had our teams behave very differently. There was definitely, a price that people thought they had to pay if they were to use a nuclear weapon each time. And there was a desire, especially on a lot of the blue players, to find options that did not involve that when they could. And I think that's understandable. Also, the blue team doesn't have a lot of great options in this situation because, the low-yield trident or slick men, you do reveal an important conventional or your nuclear deterrent capability by employing them in a limited way, and you're going to have to move that boat out of the way eventually. So, Justin, do you have anything you want to add there?
No, I think the only thing I'll say is that the dynamic within the teams, and I think this was set up well by the CNAS folks who put them together. I mean, you did have discussions internally where some would say, look, I've got this military objective, and I've got to meet it, and I've got to achieve it with whatever is available, versus others who were like, well, let's kind of think through some of the post-employment consequences. But over all of that, and this is noted in the report, and this is not making a new observation, but I think it's again salient, it's very important to think, do both sides or all sides have the same stakes in the outcome? Because if the stakes are different, that changes the way people think about the possible risks and costs of something like in theater, I'll put in quotes, limited nuclear employment.
That is definitely true. So I think we are running up against time here. Obviously, there's so many topics that we could discuss that we could go on for hours on this. And hopefully we will continue this conversation many times as we come up with better options, better solutions, and hopefully move towards a more stable and sort of secure future where we're not quite as worried about this. But I thank everyone for tuning in today online and joining us in person. Please check out the report if you haven't read it. You can download it on our website over the Brink.